when we look at the ongoing crisis in Ukraine, the explanation that usually surfaces first is pretty straightforward. It's basically Russia acting aggressively, right? Driven by President Putin wanting to rebuild a Soviet-style empire.
Yeah, that's the story most of us hear. It's really taken hold in the West.
Right.
The narrative is often, Putin's long game is restoring the old Soviet sphere, and that the annexation of Crimea in 2014 after Yanukovych was ousted, that was just the first step. And the fear is, well, what's next? More of Ukraine, neighboring countries.
But let's dig into that a bit deeper. Is that really the full picture? What if the reasons are more complex? What if it involves, more than just one side's actions?
Exactly. That's what we're diving into today.
We're looking at the argument that maybe the U.S. and its European allies, maybe they actually bear a significant share of the responsibility for how things escalated in Ukraine.
Precisely. And we're going to focus on three key areas of Western policy that this argument points to. Things like NATO expansion eastward,
right? The
European Union's own push eastward, and also the active promotion of, democracy and Western values inside Ukraine itself.
So yeah, prepare for a deeper look. This might challenge some, initial thoughts. We're going back really to the mid-90s, tracing how some of these developments arguably laid the groundwork for the conflict. It's probably a different perspective than many have heard.
Definitely. And look, first we have to acknowledge that dominant Western view.
Yeah, absolutely.
Which, as we said, blames it pretty much solely on Putin's expansionist aims. Starts with Crimea, 2014, right after Yanukovych was out.
Right.
The idea being this was just a pretext for Russia to grab territory, part of a bigger imperial project.
But the core argument we're exploring today, it really pushes back on that.
It does.
It says, hang on, that view is maybe incomplete. Or even, fundamentally flawed.
Yeah, flawed because it potentially overlooks the role played by U.S. and European policies.
That these policies were actually crucial in sort of creating the environment for the crisis.
Exactly. And one of the absolute central pillars of this alternative view, it's NATO expansion, pushing eastward.
Okay.
This is seen as a key part of a bigger Western strategy, pulling Ukraine away from Russia, basically.
Integrating it into the West.
Right. And many see this specific expansion as a primary driver of the tension.
Okay, so let's unpack that. NATO expansion. When did this really become a flashpoint with Russia?
Well, the first big wave, that was 1999. You had the Czech Republic, Hungary, Poland joining.
Right, I remember that.
Then 2004, a much bigger expansion. Bulgaria, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Romania, Slovakia, Slovenia. Quite a group.
And Russia's reaction, Moscow wasn't exactly cheering, were they?
No, definitely not. They voiced opposition right from the start, even back in 95 during the Balkan intervention. Boris Yeltsin, who was president then, he warned about NATO coming right up to Russia's border. He said the fire of war could flare up throughout Europe. Pretty strong words.
But back then, Russia was maybe weaker, right? Economically, politically. Maybe couldn't push back as hard.
That's a fair point. Russia in the late 90s, early 2000s, definitely weaker. And these first expansions, while Moscow didn't like them, they perhaps didn't feel like such a direct, immediate military threat. Most didn't share a border, except, crucially, the Baltic states.
Right. But then the focus shifted, didn't it? Further east.
Yeah.
Towards Ukraine and Georgia specifically joining NATO.
Exactly. And the 2008 NATO summit in Bucharest, that's a really critical moment.
Okay, Bucharest 2008.
Yeah. The alliance officially considered membership for both Georgia and Ukraine. The U.S. under President Bush was strong for it.
But not everyone agreed.
No. Key European allies, especially France and Germany, they were against it. They were worried primarily about provoking Russia, needlessly antagonizing them.
So what happened? Did they find some kind of middle ground, a compromise?
Sorta. The outcome was a compromise in a sense. No formal membership process started for either country, but
Certainly.
NATO issued a declaration. And it stated quite clearly that these countries will become members of NATO eventually. Will become members. So a promise of future membership. How did Moscow take that?
Moscow did not see that as a compromise at all.
No.
Their deputy foreign minister, Grushko, called it a major strategic mistake with most serious consequences.
Wow.
And Putin himself, he stated very clearly that bringing them into NATO would be a direct threat to Russia's core interests.
A direct threat.
Yeah. And there were even reports, pretty credible ones, that Putin hinted quite directly to Bush, saying, look, if Ukraine joins NATO, it might just cease to exist as a single country.
That's incredibly stark. And it wasn't just talk, was it? Because the invasion of Georgia happened not long after that summit, August 2008.
Exactly. That Russian military action in Georgia, it's widely seen as a very clear signal. Russia showing its resolve.
Saying this far no further on NATO expansion. Pretty much. Georgia's president then, Saakashvili, was pushing hard for NATO membership. He tried to reassert control over Abkhazia and South Ossetia, these breakaway regions.
Right.
And Russia, wanting to keep Georgia neutral, essentially, responded very quickly, very decisively, took control of those regions.
And yet, despite that really clear signal, NATO didn't actually take back its promise about future membership for Georgia and Ukraine.
That's right. The Bucharest Declaration wasn't officially retracted, and NATO kept expanding elsewhere, actually. Albania and Croatia joined in 2009.
Okay, so NATO expansion is one big piece. What about the EU? You mentioned the EU's own eastward push, the Eastern Partnership.
Absolutely. That was another major factor from the perspective we're exploring. Launched in May 2008, around the same time, it aimed for closer political ties, economic integration between the EU and countries like Ukraine.
And Russia saw this as
against its interests, definitely. In 2014, just before Yanukovych was ousted, Foreign Minister Lavrov accused the EU quite explicitly of trying to create a sphere of influence in Eastern Europe.
And did Moscow see a difference between EU expansion and NATO expansion? Or was it all just the West moving east?
For many in the Russian establishment, the lines were pretty blurry. There was a strong feeling or perception that EU expansion was just, a softer version of NATO expansion.
Like a Trojan horse, almost.
You could say that. Another way for the West to creep closer to what Russia saw as its vital strategic space.
Okay. And the third element you mentioned was the West promoting democracy.
Yes. Promoting Western values, democratic institutions in Ukraine and other post-Soviet states.
How did that work in practice?
It involved a lot of different things. Funding, political support for pro-Western groups, individuals, organizations.
Right.
Victoria Nuland, who was a key U.S. State Department official then, said in December 2013 that the U.S. had spent over $5 billion since 91, helping Ukraine achieve, quote, the future that it deserves.
$5 billion. And groups like the National Endowment for Democracy, the NED, were involved.
Very involved. The NED gets U.S. government funding, and it supported reportedly over 60 different civil society projects in Ukraine.
Okay.
And the NED president, Karl Gershman, he actually called Ukraine the main prize in this whole geopolitical context.
The main prize, that's quite revealing language.
It is. And after Yanukovych won the election in 2010, which many in the West saw as a setback, the NED apparently increased its support for opposition groups and democratic institutions there.
And how did Russia see all this democracy promotion, this social engineering, as you called it?
With deep suspicion, profound suspicion. They worried that what was happening in Ukraine, it could be a blueprint.
A blueprint for trying the same thing inside Russia itself.
Exactly, trying to undermine their own political system. And maybe those fears weren't totally baseless. Karl Gershman, the NED president again, wrote an op-ed in 2013.
Yeah.
He said Ukraine choosing Europe would accelerate the demise of Putin's ideology of Russian imperialism. And he even suggested Putin could end up losing power not just nearby, but in Russia itself.
Yeah. Wow. So when you put those three things together, NATO expansion, EU expansion, democracy promotion, it really does sound like a recipe for a volatile situation in Ukraine.
It certainly seems that way from this perspective. And the spark, the event that really ignited the current crisis, according to this view, was November 2013.
When Yanukovych rejected the EU deal.
Exactly. He suddenly pulled back from this big economic and political agreement with the EU, and instead he took a $15 billion bailout package from Russia.
And that triggered the Maidan protests.
Triggered massive, sustained anti-government protests, especially in Western Ukraine, the Euromaidan movement.
And things escalated tragically from there.
Very tragically. Over the next 3 months, it got more and more violent. By mid-February 2014, estimates are around 100 protesters were killed in Kyiv. Western diplomats rushed in, trying to mediate, find a resolution.
Right.
And on February 21st, they actually reached an agreement, on paper anyway, between the government and opposition leaders.
What was the deal?
Yanukovych would stay in power, but with reduced authority until new elections later that year.
But that deal fell apart almost immediately, didn't it?
Almost instantly. The very next day, February 22nd, Yanukovych fled Kyiv, ended up in Russia.
And then?
A new government took charge in Kyiv very quickly. And this government was, strongly pro-Western and very anti-Russian in its outlook.
Okay.
It's also worth noting, some observers pointed out that certain high-ranking members of this new government held views described as, neo-fascist.
And what about the U.S. role in all this, that rapid change of power? There were questions, controversies.
Yeah, the exact extent of U.S. involvement is definitely debated, but there's little doubt Washington liked the outcome. You had high-profile Americans like Victoria Nuland, Senator McCain, actually participating in the protests in Kyiv.
Right, they were physically there.
They were. And the U.S. ambassador, Jeffrey Payette, said after Yanukovych left, "This day will go down in the history books." Plus, there was that leaked phone call.
Ah, yes, the Nuland-Payette call.
Exactly, where Nuland clearly states her preference for Yatsenyuk to be the next prime minister, which is exactly what happened.
So given all that, it's maybe not surprising that Russia saw the West as being complicit in removing Yanukovych.
From Moscow's perspective, it looked very much like a Western-backed coup against Ukraine's, legitimate, if unpopular, president.
Okay, so that brings us to Russia's reaction.
Yeah.
How did Putin respond to what they saw happening in Kyiv?
Putin and the leadership decided, okay, this is the moment to act decisively, both regarding Ukraine and sending a message to the West.
And the first move was Crimea.
Almost immediately after February 22nd, Putin ordered Russian forces into Crimea, which, remember, had a majority Russian population and housed Russia's key Black Sea Fleet base in Sevastopol.
Right.
Russia then quickly annexed Crimea. The justification was protecting the rights of the Russian-speaking population who, they said, wanted to join Russia, and the existing military presence there made it relatively easy.
And beyond Crimea, Russia put pressure on the new Kyiv government too, right, to limit its westward drift.
Absolutely. Significant pressure, multifaceted pressure, to stop Kyiv aligning too closely with the West or doing anything that threatened Russia's core strategic interests.
How do they do that?
Putin basically made it clear he'd rather see Ukraine destabilized, even broken up, than let it become a Western outpost right on Russia's border.
So implicit threats, but also concrete actions.
Yes, both. Russia provided major support advisors, weapons, diplomatic help to the separatists in eastern Ukraine, especially the Donbass.
Fueling the civil war there.
Exactly, fueling that long, bloody conflict. At the same time, Russia built up huge numbers of troops on the Ukrainian border, a clear signal they were ready to intervene militarily.
And economic pressure, too.
They hiked the price of natural gas they sold to Ukraine, demanded repayment of old debts, using economic levers to squeeze the new government. Putin was definitely playing hardball.
It really highlights how important Ukraine is strategically from Russia's point of view. Maybe something the West didn't fully grasp.
That seems to be a crucial part of this argument. Ukraine sits on this huge flat plain. Historically, an invasion route into Russia from the West.
Right.
So for Russia, keeping Ukraine as a neutral buffer state, that's seen as absolutely fundamental, a core strategic imperative.
So from that perspective, no Russian leader could accept NATO in Ukraine.
Exactly. Or stand by while the West helped install a government determined to integrate with the West.
And while the U.S. might disagree strongly, that logic, it does sound like traditional great power thinking.
It really does. It fits classic geopolitical realism. Big powers are always sensitive about threats near their core territory. Think about the U.S. and the Monroe Doctrine, or Cuba during the Cold War.
Yeah.
And beyond just the logic, Russian leaders had told the West repeatedly, we oppose NATO membership for Georgia and Ukraine.
They said it explicitly.
Explicitly, and opposed efforts to turn those countries against Russia. The 2008 Georgia war was a very stark demonstration of their willingness to use force over this.
So what was the typical Western response to these Russian warnings? Did they try to address the concerns?
Well, U.S. officials and European allies often argued they had tried to reassure Russia. They'd say, NATO's purely defensive. It has no hostile intent towards Russia.
Right, the defensive alliance.
Exactly. NATO insisted expansion wasn't about containing Russia. They pointed to things like not permanently stationing large combat forces in the new member states bordering Russia initially. And they set up the NATO-Russia Council in 2002 for dialogue.
Right.
And remember the missile defense issue. In 2009, the U.S. shifted plans, putting systems on ships instead of, say, Poland or the Czech Republic, partly to ease Russian fears.
But clearly, those reassurances weren't enough for Moscow. Not when it came to Ukraine.
No, absolutely not. Russia continued to fiercely oppose any prospect of NATO membership for Georgia, and especially Ukraine. They saw it as an existential threat. And ultimately, realism suggests it's Russia that decides what it considers a threat to its security, not its potential rivals. That's just how great powers tend to operate.
It is pretty striking, though, why the West didn't seem to fully anticipate these consequences, given the history, the warnings.
Yeah, to understand that, you really have to go back to the mid-90s again, when the Clinton administration started pushing for NATO expansion.
Mm-hmm.
Inside the U.S. foreign policy world, there were different views. It wasn't like some huge popular demand drove it, though groups like Eastern European emigres were strongly for it, understandably wanting security for places like Poland and Hungary.
Right.
And even some realists supported it, thinking maybe Russia still needed containing.
But you said earlier, most realists were actually against it.
Yes, the majority were. People like George Kennan. Their argument was basically, Russia's declining, it has demographic problems, its economy relies on resources. It's not a major threat needing this kind of provocation.
They worried it would backfire.
Exactly. That expanding NATO wouldn't contain Russia, but would actually incentivize Moscow to cause trouble nearby, push back against this perceived encroachment. Kennan famously called it a tragic mistake back in '98, predicted a bad Russian reaction, said, "We had no reason to do this."
So if it wasn't a clear strategic necessity agreed upon by everyone, what really drove the expansion policy?
According to this analysis, it was largely the triumph of a liberal worldview in Western foreign policy circles after the Cold War.
Okay, liberalism versus realism.
Right. Liberals, like many in the Clinton administration, genuinely believed the end of the Cold War changed everything. That realist logic, power politics, was obsolete. A new cooperative era was dawning.
And the U.S. role in that?
The U.S. was the indispensable nation, right? A benevolent hegemon. Russia shouldn't feel threatened by its actions. The goal was to remake Eastern Europe in the West's image.
Through democracy, free markets.
Exactly. Promote democracy, foster economic interdependence, bring these countries into international institutions like NATO and the EU.
And they persuaded European allies.
Pretty easily, yeah. The success of the EU itself had convinced many Europeans that geopolitics was basically dead, that this liberal order could keep the peace.
So by the early 2000s, this liberal view was dominant.
Completely dominant in European security thinking. NATO's open door policy faced almost no realist opposition anymore. You see it in statements from leaders like Obama talking about ideals versus older notions of power, or Kerry calling Crimea 19th century behavior.
So this fundamental clash of worldviews, Western liberalism versus Russian realism, was a key factor in the Ukraine crisis unfolding.
That's the core of the argument. Putin and a circle think like realists, national interest, power balance. The West thinks like liberals, cooperation, democracy, rules-based order. And because of that fundamental difference, the U.S. and its allies perhaps inadvertently provoked a major crisis.
Okay, so if that's the argument about the causes, let's talk about blame. The common view in the West is just to blame Putin, right?
Yes. Which fits exactly what George Kennan predicted back in '98. He said if a crisis happened, the expansion proponents would say, see, we told you the Russians were like that.
Right.
And today, yeah, many Western officials pin it all on Putin's aggression. Remember, Angela Merkel reportedly said he was irrational, lives in another world. Mm-hmm. But look, while Putin's definitely autocratic, there's not much evidence he's mentally unstable. Most analysts see him as a very calculating, rational strategist, operating by realist rules, even if we don't like them.
What about the argument that he just wants to rebuild the Soviet Union? That Ukraine is just the first step?
That's another common explanation. Crimea was a test case, a prelude to grabbing more of Ukraine, maybe other former Soviet states. Some even compare him to Hitler, saying NATO needs to expand now to stop him.
Containing Russian expansionism.
Right. Admit Georgia and Ukraine to draw a line.
But does that argument really hold up when you look closely?
Well, the counter-argument is, if Putin really wanted a greater Russia by force, wouldn't we have seen more signs before February 2014?
Good point.
There wasn't much indication he planned to grab Crimea before Yanukovych fell. Even Western leaders were wary of provoking Russia militarily back then. Crimea looked more like a reaction, a spontaneous move after the government change in Kyiv.
And the practicalities of conquering Ukraine.
Huge challenges, trying to conquer and annex even eastern Ukraine, let alone the whole country. You're talking about millions of people, mostly nationalistic, who would likely resist.
An insurgency nightmare.
Exactly. It would be incredibly costly for Russia's military, its economy, especially with sanctions. History shows occupations are incredibly difficult, even for powerful nations. Think Afghanistan, Vietnam, Iraq.
Right.
So Putin probably understands how hard that would be, which suggests his actions might be more defensive strategically than offensive expansionism.
Okay, so given that analysis, the complex causes, the realist motivations, What's a better way forward than just blaming Putin and doubling down?
Well, the current Western approach, largely because it denies Russia has legitimate security concerns here, has been mostly to intensify the existing policies. More pressure, tougher sanctions, hoping to deter Russia or force a policy change.
But you mentioned the reluctance for military action.
Right. Despite saying all options are on the table, neither the U.S. nor NATO allies seem willing to actually fight for Ukraine.
And the sanctions.
They've had an impact, sure, but haven't really changed Putin's core calculations. And getting truly crippling sanctions implemented is hard. Countries like Germany worry about Russian retaliation, especially with energy. Plus, even if they did impose super tough sanctions, history suggests states will endure a lot to protect what they see as vital interests. Russia probably isn't different.
And continuing with things, Russia sees as provocative high-level meetings in Kyiv, the EU's Eastern Partnership, NATO's open door talk that doesn't help de-escalate things either.
No, from this perspective, it likely just reinforces Moscow's view that the West is determined to pull Ukraine into its sphere, making tensions worse.
So the current path seems risky, maybe counterproductive. What's the alternative, according to this view?
A fundamentally different approach. The U.S. and its allies would need to rethink their whole goal for Ukraine.
Instead of full Westernization.
Right. Instead, aim to make Ukraine a neutral buffer state between NATO and Russia, kind of like Austria during the Cold War.
Neutrality.
Yes. Western leaders would need to acknowledge how important Ukraine is to Putin strategically and accept that a strongly anti-Russian government in Kyiv tied to the West probably isn't sustainable from Moscow's viewpoint.
But not pro-Russian either.
No, not pro-Russian or anti-NATO. Just sovereign, independent, but outside both camps. Neutral.
Okay. What specific steps would that take?
Several key things. First, a clear, formal rejection of future NATO membership for Georgia and Ukraine. Take it off the table.
It's a big one.
Huge. Second, the West could lead an international effort, EU, IMF, U.S., and Russia, to rescue Ukraine's economy. Russia actually has an interest in a stable neighbor, so they might welcome that.
Okay. What else?
Third, significantly scale back Western social engineering efforts inside Ukraine. Less direct political interference. And fourth, really focus on making sure Ukraine respects the rights of all its minorities, especially the Russian-speaking population. Address their grievances.
Now, you can already hear the objections in the West. This rewards aggression. It damages U.S. credibility.
Absolutely. Those arguments would definitely be made. But the counter is, wouldn't continuing the current policy, which arguably helped cause the crisis and risks more conflict, be more damaging to credibility? Maybe other countries would actually respect a power willing to admit mistakes and adopt a more pragmatic policy.
And what about Ukraine's right to choose its own alliances?
That's always raised. But the realist counter is, well, in great power politics, might often influences what's possible. Abstract rights mean less when powerful states clash near their borders.
Like the U.S. position on Cuba and the Soviets.
Exactly. And arguably, it's in Ukraine's own interest to be careful with its powerful neighbor. Plus, even if Ukraine wants to join NATO or the EU, the West isn't obligated to say yes, especially if it's based on a flawed policy that risks major conflict, primarily harming Ukrainians.
What about the argument that Russia's just an enemy and appeasement makes them stronger?
Another common concern. But again, the analysis suggests Russia is actually weakening long-term. And even if it weren't, the West's unwillingness to fight for Ukraine shows it's not really a vital Western strategic interest. So why extend NATO guarantees you're not prepared to back up? That seems foolish.
It could actually drag NATO into a confrontation.
Precisely. The current policy also damages cooperation with Moscow on other issues, Afghanistan, Iran, Syria, counterterrorism, and it pushes Russia closer to China.
So the choice, as this argument presents it,
it's basically keep pushing a policy of rivalry that's hurting Ukraine, damaging relations with Russia, a lose-lose, or change course. Aim for a stable, neutral Ukraine, allowing for better West-Russia relations, a potential win-win.
Subscribe to our podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. We are here to make things clear. New episodes every day.